This anime series begins by showing a flashback of a boy reading a fairy tale book about a hero who managed to defeat the Demon King and bring about world peace. After reading the book, the boy seemed inspired by the story and aspired to become a hero in upholding justice. The scene then switches to the future and shows a view of the city of Fegite, located in the southern region of the Alzano Empire. In the city of Fegite, there is the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy, the highest institution where one can learn the latest magic, and a prestigious academy sacred to those who study there. One day, Rumia Tingel, who is one of the students at Alzano Imperial Magic Academy, tries to heal an injured old man by using her magic power. Despite being a novice, Rumia managed to heal the old man and was praised for her abilities. When Rumia was about to leave the place, a silver-haired girl ran towards her. That girl was Sistine Fibel, who was also a student at the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy. On the way to school, Rumia and Sistine talked about a teacher named Mr. Huey, who resigned from his job suddenly. Mr. Huey was a teacher they greatly admired, and both hoped that the teacher who would replace him would have a kind and friendly attitude like their former teacher. When they reached the town square, they were surprised by the appearance of a man running hastily towards them. Sistine reflexively used her magic power on the man, sending him bouncing until he finally plunged into a pool not far away. Sistine, who admitted her mistake, then apologized to the man for being rude, even though she didn't do it on purpose. However, seeing the man's inappropriate behavior towards Rumia, Sistine immediately became irritated and returned to using her magic to get rid of the man. Not long after, Sistine and Rumia finally arrived at the school and rushed into their class while waiting for the new homeroom teacher to replace Mr. Huey. Sistine and her classmates seemed worried because the new homeroom teacher did not come, even though the class had started. A few minutes later, a man named Glenn Radars finally entered the class and introduced himself as their new homeroom teacher. Sistine and Rumia suddenly felt surprised because the man they met this morning in the town square was their new homeroom teacher. Glenn was about to introduce himself further, but Sistine, who was still annoyed with Glenn, then asked him to teach immediately because the class had started. But unexpectedly, Glenn instead told the students to self-study while he chose to sleep in his seat. Seeing this, Sistine became even more irritated with Glenn, not even bothering to throw the book at him and tell him to teach them. Glenn, who was urged by Sistine, was finally forced to fight his drowsiness and started teaching in front of the class. However, Sistine and her classmates could not understand the lessons taught by Glenn because his handwriting was very bad, and Glenn's explanations were too wordy. Afterward, a student named Lynn tries to ask Glenn about something related to the lessons they are studying. Surprisingly, Glenn openly told his students that he didn't know the answer and told them to find the answer themselves. Upon hearing that, Sistine became even more irritated and scolded Glenn for his careless attitude while teaching. Furthermore, Sistine told Glenn that he should have explained the lessons they didn't understand instead of telling them to study independently. But Glenn even argued that the students should be more independent and try to find the answers on their own. Suddenly, a bell sounded in their debate, signaling the break time had arrived. Glenn rushed to the door without further ado, leaving Sistine and her classmates, who were annoyed that they had not learned anything from him. Meanwhile, in the headmaster's room, a teacher named Hallie Astrai seems to be raising his objections because the headmaster, Rick Walken, employs Glenn, who is a third-level wizard who is not competent enough to be a teacher at the most prestigious magic academy in the Alzano Empire. Rick then explains to Hallie that he hired Glenn as a teacher on the recommendation of Celica Arphonia, who is the professor at the academy. Knowing that Hallie disapproved of Glenn's presence as a teacher at Alzano Imperial Magic Academy, Celica met Hallie in the headmaster's room, then threatened him by saying that she won't hesitate to kill him if he hurt Glenn. Hallie, who realized that Celica was serious about her threat, then decided to leave that place because he didn't have enough courage to fight Celica, who was much stronger than him. Rick then asked Celica why she had recruited Glenn as a teacher at the academy. Celica tells Rick that she just wanted Glenn to live his life normally. She didn't want to go into more detail about Glenn's past, and Rick seemed to understand that because he didn't question anything anymore. In the meantime, Sistine, who was in the women's dressing room, still complained about Glenn's very irresponsible attitude and telling them to self-study. Rumia tried to calm Sistine down by saying that Glenn probably didn't have any experience in teaching in schools. In the middle of their conversation, suddenly, the dressing room door opened, and Glenn was seen standing in front of the door. Thinking that Glenn was about to peek at the female students changing clothes, Sistine quickly ran towards him and threw him backward. Since then, Sistine has always been in a fight with Glenn. She thought Glenn did not deserve to be a teacher with his lazy attitude and always ignoring his students. On the other hand, Glenn thought that Sistine's attitude was very annoying for being too intrusive in his affairs. One day, Sistine, who was unable to contain her anger, threw her gloves at Glenn, indicating that she was challenging him to a fight with her. Without thinking, Glenn immediately accepted the challenge, although, in the end, Sistine could easily defeat Glenn, who chose not to use his magic against his student. Even though he was defeated by his own student in a magic duel, Glenn still came to school to teach the next day. As usual, Glenn told the students to self-study while he slept in class. Lynn tried to ask Glenn about something related to the magic runes. But Sistine told Glenn not to ask Glenn because he was completely unreliable as a teacher. Sistine even insulted Glenn, who, according to her, did not know about the importance of magic in living life on Earth. Upon hearing that, Glenn asked Sistine to explain why she thought magic was important and valuable in this world. Sistine explains that witchcraft has many benefits in human life. But Glenn disagreed with this because, according to him, other sciences, such as medicine, agriculture, and infrastructure, were far more useful to learn than magic. Furthermore, Glenn told Sistine and her classmates that they were just wasting their time studying witchcraft because, in the end, humans only use witchcraft to kill each other. When the students were astonished to hear Glenn's words that were very demeaning to magic, Sistine then approached Glenn and slapped him while holding back her tears because she was annoyed by the teacher's words. Glenn was shocked to see Sistine crying and realized he had made a mistake. In the afternoon, Glenn saw Rumia, who was practicing magic alone in a room. Seeing Rumia, who was really serious about learning about magic circles, Glenn then approached her and helped her by adding certain materials that Rumia had forgotten. After that, Glenn then told Rumia to cast a spell, and not long after, the magic circle finally activated and gave off a very beautiful colorful light. Glenn, who saw the sparkling colorful lights in front of him, then remembered his childhood when he first learned about magic and was very excited to learn it. Glenn then drove Rumia back to her house. On the way, he asked why Rumia was so crazy about magic. Rumia then tells Glenn that she has been captured by the dark sorcerers. When she was about to be killed, she was saved by a mysterious man who had very powerful magical powers. Since that incident, Rumia has been determined to master magic so that she can save others, just like the mysterious man who had saved her. She also hopes that one day she can meet her savior again and thank him. Hearing that, Glenn then observed Rumia closely, remembering whether he had ever met Rumia before because her face felt familiar to him. Rumia then tells Glenn that she was adopted by Sistine's family, so she is currently living at Sistine's house. Glenn then took Rumia to Sistine's house as she requested. Before entering the house, Rumia told Glenn why Sistine was determined to become a magician because she wanted to fulfill her late grandfather's last wish. Sistine's grandfather hoped that she could become a great magician in the future so that she could uncover the secret of the power of Malgalia's sky castle that hovers above the city of Fejite. It is regarded as one of the noble symbols of the city. The next day, Sistine and the students were surprised by Glenn apologizing while bowing to Sistine. After realizing that his students were very serious about learning magic, Glenn decided to start seriously teaching magic to his students. He started his lesson by calling his students a bunch of idiots who didn't understand real magic because they only focused on learning the knowledge of magic written in books. Glenn then practiced the shock bowl technique, the most basic technique in magic that the students had mastered, as well as the spell Sistine used to defeat Glenn in a magic duel some time ago. However, what surprised the students was when Glenn didn't cast a convoluted incantation to perform the technique, as they usually did. In fact, he could use various variations of the shock bowl technique by simply casting a fairly short spell. Sistine and her classmates were surprised to see Glenn, who could use magic without the need to recite the spells written in the book, because all this time, the students thought that they would not be able to use magic if they made a mistake in chanting the spell. Glenn then explained that magic is not learned from books but must be believed from the heart. Therefore, he then asked his students to throw away all the magic manuals they had and teach magic to them in a way that was quite easy to understand. Glenn suddenly became famous among the students in a short time because his teaching style was out of the box. Even students from other classes flocked to Sistine's classroom to listen to Glenn's explanation of magic. Over time, Glenn's popularity as a teacher increased rapidly. Even though he was surrounded by students who admired him, Glenn seemed more close with Sistine and Rumia, the two girls he met for the first time. Towards dusk, when Glenn was alone, Celica approached him and asked him how he was because, recently, Glenn seemed happier and more excited after becoming a teacher at Alzano Imperial Magic Academy. One day, Glenn, who was in a hurry to go to school, was intercepted by a man named Leo who had a snake tattooed on his arm. At the same time, two mysterious men who also have tattoos infiltrate Sistine's classroom to take Rumia away. Sistine and her classmates tried to protect Rumia, but they were then threatened by the two men. Even Sistine and her classmates couldn't fight them because the two men possessed military-grade magic power, which was impossible for ordinary school students to beat. Rumia, who didn't want Sistine and her classmates to get hurt because of her, chose to surrender herself to the two men. However, one of them, a man named Jin Ganes, decided to arrest Sistine because she insisted on helping Rumia. Jin then takes Sistine to an empty room and intends to harass her. But then, Glenn suddenly entered the room and approached them. Sistine then told Glenn to run away because she thought Glenn didn't have enough strength to fight Jin, who mastered military-grade magic. A surprising thing happened when Jin launched an attack on Glenn, which did not work on him. Seeing Jin, who was very surprised, Glenn then explained that he had activated the artificial magic to block attacks within a certain distance. although the technique was very effective as a defense. As a result, Glenn couldn't use magic at the same distance. After hearing this, Jin suddenly became even more shocked because only high-level magicians could create artificial magic, while Glenn was only a third-level magician. Even though he can't use magic against Jin, Glenn has a pretty great fighting ability, so he can easily defeat Jin. Shortly afterward, a swarm of skeleton soldiers bursts out of a magic portal that appeared on the wall in front of them. With Sistine's help, Glenn was able to use magic to eliminate some of them. But because the army of skulls kept popping up, Glenn and Sistine decided to flee from the place. When they were finally pressed, Glenn was forced to use military-grade magic to annihilate the entire army of skulls. He immediately collapsed helplessly after using the high-level magic technique because, apparently, he couldn't use high-level magic continuously because it could drain his strength. Not long after that, one of Jin's comrades, Rake Fohenheim, arrived at the place and immediately activated the magical barrier before Glenn could use the artificial magic. Glenn was seen whispering his plan to Sistine. When Glenn tried to block Rake's attack, suddenly Sistine appeared behind Glenn and managed to break Rake's magic. Glenn then took the opportunity to fight Rake and managed to kill the man with his own sword. After that, he left the place to save Rumia. However, Glenn, who had exhausted his strength and suffered severe injuries from his battle with Rake, finally collapsed for the second time. Sistine is worried about her teacher's condition, then tries to treat Glenn's wound with healing magic and delivers her power to her teacher. As Glenn remembered his childhood dream of becoming a hero, Sistine suddenly fainted, followed by Glenn, who collapsed unconscious next to her. After being unconscious for several hours, Glenn finally woke up to find Sistine still unconscious beside him. Glenn then thanked Sistine because she had healed him and delivered her power to him so that he could recover soon. Glenn then contacted Celica and recounted an incident of assault by a group of people who had snake tattoos on their arms. Celica and the teachers turned out to be attending a meeting in another place that was quite far from the school, so they didn't know about the incident. Celica asked Glenn to stay alert while she and the teachers tried to find another way to return to the academy as soon as possible, as the magic portal located in the academy had been damaged by their enemies. Celica warned Glenn about the possibility of the traitor, as only a handful of people knew the location of the magic portal in the academy. After getting information about the location of the magic portal from Celica, Glenn rushed over there and found Rumia, who was being held captive in the magic circle. Not only that, but Glenn also discovered that the mastermind behind Rumia's kidnapping was Huey Lyson, the former teacher who had taught at the academy. Huey turned out to be a member of the Researchers of Divine Wisdom, one of the oldest organizations operating in the Alzano Empire. He intends to hand over Rumia to the organization because she is an important key for its members to achieve their goals. Glenn, who could not let his students be in danger, then tried to destroy the magical barriers that imprisoned Rumia. However, even though Glenn could use high-level magic techniques, he had a hard time breaking the magical barriers, as his condition hadn't fully recovered from the previous battle. When he was about to destroy the last barrier, Glenn collapsed from exhaustion. Rumia, who saw her teacher trying hard to save her, then desperately penetrated the magical barrier to deliver her magical power to Glenn. After gaining the power of Rumia, Glenn finally rises again to destroy the magical barriers and defeat Huey. Shortly afterward, Sistine arrived at the place and was very surprised to find out that Mr. Huey, the teacher they admire, was the mastermind behind the assault incident at their school. A few days after that incident, Glenn seemed to have a conversation with Celica about Huey and the Researchers of Divine Wisdom targeting Rumia. Celica reveals to Glenn that Rumia is actually Princess Ermiana, who was rumored to have died 3 years ago. Huey and his organization seem to have found out about Rumia's true identity and intended to use her to bring down the Alzano Empire. Sometime later, Sistine and Rumia announced to their classmates that Alzano Imperial Magic Academy would hold magic competitions. In contrast to Sistine and Rumia, who seemed so excited to participate in the magic duel, their classmates looked unenthusiastic. They felt pessimistic because their abilities were fairly average compared to students from other classes. Hearing this, Glenn encouraged his students and confidently said that they would win the competition. Glenn, who had been observing his students' abilities, then grouped them according to the type of competition they would participate in. In addition, he also promised victory to his students as long as they practiced and obeyed all his words. The next day, Glenn and his students headed to the field to start their practice. Once there, Glenn clashed with Hallie over fighting over territory for practice. Glenn, feeling offended that Hallie looked down on him, then challenged Hallie to bet with him. Glenn said he would hand his 3 months' salary to Hallie if his students didn't win the competition. On the other hand, Hallie had to do the same if Glenn's students were to win. Hallie felt confident that she could win the competition and immediately accepted Glenn's challenge. Sistine and her classmates looked surprised to see Glenn because he was not usually so excited, especially to compete with Hallie and win the magic competition. At first, Glenn did not care about the competition, but after knowing that the homeroom teacher will get a big bonus if his class wins the competition, Glenn gets excited because he really needs money. Long story short, the day of the competition arrived. The students looked enthusiastic and very excited to take part in every competition. Since the magic competitions were an important event, Queen Alicia and several imperial officials were seen attending the event to watch the students competing. Queen Alicia also delivered a speech to encourage the students before the competition started. On the other hand, Rumia, who saw the necklace worn by the queen, seemed a little disappointed because her mother was wearing a necklace with a different pendant from the one she had. Race after the race was finally held, and Glenn's class got third place in the provisional score. Rumia, who took part in the mental endurance competition, even managed to become the first winner despite her small and slim figure. Glenn and Sistine were also very proud of Rumia for continuing to fight until the end, despite being mentally intimidated by the judges and her rivals. Meanwhile, elsewhere, two members of the Imperial Court Mage Corps named Riel Rayford and Albert Frasers were assigned to monitor the movement of Queen Alicia's protective troops because they received information about the traitor who was quite close to the queen. Riel and Albert suspect Zelos Draghart, the royal guard captain currently standing next to the queen, as the traitor. Even though they already have a list of suspects, Albert and Riel choose not to act rashly and remain vigilant because the most important thing right now is the safety of the queen. During the break time, Lynn, who will follow the next race, asks Glenn to help her do the transformation magic. Glenn then demonstrates the technique and transforms into Rumia while suggesting Lynn transform into someone she knows well. After Lynn left that place to participate in the race, Glenn, still in Rumia's form, was approached by Sistine. Thinking that the girl standing in front of her was her foster sister, Sistine offered her some food. But then, the real Rumia appeared behind her, so Sistine immediately knew that the girl in front of her was an imposter. She then uses her magic and Glenn's disguise is finally exposed. Later, Glenn, who was alone in the backyard of the school, was approached by Rumia, who gave him sandwiches as an expression of gratitude because Glenn had helped her. Not long after, Glenn and Rumia were surprised by the appearance of Queen Alicia, who came to the place without an escort. Seeing Rumia, who was there, Queen Alicia then expressed her longing for her daughter. However, Rumia, knowing that her mother deliberately abandoned her, chooses not to recognize the queen as her mother and emphasizes that she is Rumia Tingel, not Princess Ermiana. Holding back the sadness and disappointment of being reunited with the figure of her mother, who had abandoned her, Rumia rushed to leave the place. Although it was sad to see her daughter acting like a stranger to her, the queen could understand this because the bad incident that happened to Rumia 3 years ago was her fault. When Queen Alicia was about to return to her place, Zelos and his soldiers intercepted her and asked the queen not to wander around alone. Albert, who could see all the events experienced by the queen through his magic eye, then told Riel that Zelos and his soldiers were taking the queen somewhere. At the same time, Rumia, who was sitting alone in the garden, was approached by Glenn, who tried to cheer her up. In their conversation, suddenly a group of imperial soldiers appeared who drew swords at them, saying that they had been ordered by Queen Alicia to kill Princess Ermiana, who was none other than Rumia. Hearing that, Rumia immediately slumped down because she didn't think that the queen was planning to kill her, even though the queen had just expressed her longing when they met earlier. On the other hand, Glenn suddenly realized something was wrong because he felt very sure that Queen Alicia would never issue an order to kill her own daughter. Glenn then tried to fight the soldiers, but one of the soldiers managed to make him collapse unconscious. They then caught Rumia and tied her to a tree. Glenn suddenly appeared when the imperial soldiers were about to execute Rumia and he immediately saved her. Glenn hurriedly carried Rumia away from the place and headed to a small alley, where he then contacted Celica via the magic bracelet to ask what was going on. However, Celica, who was watching the race and sitting next to the queen, couldn't answer the question and instead told Glenn that he was the only person who could solve the current problem and asked him to come directly to the queen. Celica's entire movements were supervised by a royal maid named Alina Charlotte, a member of the Researchers of Divine Wisdom and Zelos. Alina and Zelos threatened the queen by forcing her to wear an enchanted necklace. If the queen performs actions that are not in accordance with their orders, then the queen will lose her life. Because of the threat, Celica also couldn't act rashly because she preferred to prioritize the safety of the queen and also the students at the academy. Not long after, Riel appeared before Glenn and Rumia and immediately launched an attack on the two of them. Glenn managed to dodge the attack, even breaking Riel's magic sword. Albert then appeared and immediately stopped the attack while telling Riel to stop playing around. Since Glenn was once part of the Imperial Court Mage Corps, just like Albert and Riel, they knew Glenn very well and still considered him their partner. Albert and Riel, who aimed to save the queen, then decide to cooperate with Glenn and defeat Zelos and his men who have betrayed him. Glenn and Rumia then devise a plan to approach the queen by transforming into Albert and Riel, while Albert and Riel will use transformation magic and transform into Glenn and Rumia to outwit the Imperial soldiers who want to capture them. After they switched places, Glenn and Rumia in the form of Albert and Riel then returned to the race to cheer on Sistine and her team who would fight in the final match. Glenn then told his students that he would treat them if they managed to win the magic competitions. After getting the full support of her friends, Sistine finally managed to win the match with the high-level magic technique she had used against the skeleton army some time ago. Because Sistine and her classmates were in first place because they got the highest score, Glenn's class was finally crowned the winner of the magic competition. According to the rules, representatives of the winners of the magic competitions will have the opportunity to meet the queen. After finally confronting the queen, Glenn and Rumia then broke their disguise, and Glenn asks the queen to order him to subdue Zelos and the traitors. But unexpectedly, Queen Alicia instead ordered Glenn to kill Rumia while saying she was very sorry for bringing Rumia into the world. Rumia immediately sat down, and her heart was filled with deep sadness when she heard her mother's words. However, Glenn did not believe that the queen would say such a thing because 3 years ago, the queen begged him with tears in her eyes so that he would always protect Rumia. Glenn firmly believed that Queen Alicia would never issue an order to kill her own daughter unless the queen was under the influence of strong magic, which forced her to be cruel to Rumia. Glenn then ran towards the queen, but Zelos quickly knocked him down. All of that turned out to be Glenn's plan to activate his artificial magic so that the queen was free from the influence of the dark magic contained in her necklace. After the necklace was finally released, Glenn then asked the queen to reveal the truth to her daughter. Queen Alicia immediately hugged Rumia tightly while saying she really loved her daughter and apologized to her for all the bad things that had happened to Rumia during the last 3 years. Meanwhile, Albert and Riel try to catch Alina, who tries to escape after Glenn defeats Zelos. But the attempt failed because Alina was clever enough to escape from both of them. After capturing the traitors and rescuing the queen, Glenn and Rumia then joined Sistine and her classmates who were partying at a restaurant because Glenn had promised to treat them if they won the magic competition. Although he managed to save the queen and Rumia and win the magic competitions in the end, Glenn was not necessarily happy because the money he bet with Hallie and the bonus given by the headmaster just ran out to pay the restaurant bills. After learning about Rumia's past and what happened to her during the magic competitions, Sistine decides to increase her powers to protect her foster sister. She then goes to Glenn and asks him to help her learn military-grade magic because she finds out that Glenn used to be part of the Imperial Court Mage Corps. At first, Glenn didn't want to teach Sistine because military-grade magic was too dangerous and could plunge its users into their dark side. However, after seeing Sistine's strong determination to protect Rumia, he finally agrees to help her and feels confident that Sistine will not fall into the dark. In addition to teaching military-level magic, Glenn then teaches Sistine martial arts so that she does not rely too much on magic and can defend herself with martial arts if at any time she cannot use her magic. One day, when Glenn was about to head to the academy with Sistine and Rumia, they were surprised by the appearance of Riel, who tried to attack Glenn with her large sword. Despite knowing Riel's habit of always asking him to fight as a form of their friendship, what surprised Glenn more was Riel, who wore the uniform of a female student at the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy. Riel then explained that she had been assigned to disguise herself as a female student at the Magic Academy to prevent the enemies from causing a riot in the school that could threaten the safety of Rumia and also the other students. Hearing this, Rumia then thanked Riel, even though she openly said that she protects Rumia only because she is assigned to do so and doesn't really care about her. Glenn then put Riel into his class and asked her to introduce herself in front of her friends. Surprisingly, Riel even revealed her identity as part of the Imperial Court Mage Corps to her classmates. Glenn immediately refuted Riel's words by saying that she had aspirations to become the Imperial Court Mage. Knowing that Glenn is familiar with Riel enough to know her dream, the students then questioned the relationship between the two of them. Riel openly said that Glenn is the most valuable person in her life and she will always protect him. Afterward, Glenn and his students practiced magic techniques in the field, where Sistine demonstrated her greatly improved abilities. Seeing this, Glenn and his students also praised Sistine because she is the only student in their class whose strength stands out the most. On the next turn, Glenn asked Riel to perform a magic technique in front of her classmates. However, Riel again did the surprising thing. She used military magic to summon her large sword and launched an attack at the target puppet. Seeing this, her classmates were scared and thought that Riel was a scary girl. However, Sistine and Rumia, as well as their classmates, tried to familiarize themselves with Riel because they thought she was their friend. Glenn, who was observing Sistine and the others as they tried to befriend Riel, then realized something and rushed to meet Celica. Glenn thought Riel was sent to the academy not to protect Rumia so she could socialize with other people like normal humans in general. Sometime later, Glenn and his students went on a study tour to visit the White Alchemy Research Lab outside the city. They then spent some time having fun on the beach before heading to the inn. Glenn and his students had a small party at the inn in the evening. Seeing Glenn looking so happy, Riel was surprised and envious because he looked very mysterious and gloomy while still in the Imperial Court Mage Corps. Sistine and Rumia then took Riel to the beach to enjoy the beautiful night sky. They then play on the beach and Riel looks happy when Sistine and Rumia emphasize that now they are friends, so Riel no longer feels lonely. When the students were asleep at midnight, Riel secretly went to Glenn and asked him why he had left the Imperial Court Mage Corps. Riel apparently was devastated by Glenn's departure and thought he had left her on purpose. Instead of explaining what Riel wanted, Glenn instead asked Riel to stay with them at the academy, thinking that she would feel happier if surrounded by people who cared about her, like Sistine and Rumia. Hearing this, Riel got angry because actually she just wanted to be alone with Glenn, and thought that Sistine and Rumia had snatched Glenn from her side. The next day, as they headed to the White Alchemy Research Lab on foot, Sistine and Rumia tried to approach the gloomy-looking Riel. But unexpectedly, Riel snapped at them and just walked away. Sistine and Rumia were surprised to see Riel's attitude suddenly turn violent and away from them. Seeing this, Glenn then calmed his students by saying Riel was experiencing anxiety and needed time to be alone. Not long after, they finally arrived at their destination and were greeted by a middle-aged man named Birks Blomon, who was the head of the White Alchemy Research Lab. Birks explained about white magic that can be combined with alchemy to create new breakthroughs in the wizarding world that have never existed. The students then entered a research room that displayed the experimental results of the combination of white magic and alchemy. Because most of the experimental subjects were animals, Rumia suddenly felt sad because she thought the experiment had made the animals suffer. Birks then approached Rumia and Sistine and explained Project Revive Life, an experiment to create an artificial human using human DNA and very rare pure magic. Seeing the frightened Rumia and Sistine, Glenn then warned Birks not to mention Project Revive Life, because the experiment had been stopped years ago. However, Birks told Glenn and his students that the researchers of Divine Wisdom had managed to get hold of the Project Revive Life database and were just waiting for time to perfect the experiment. When they were about to go home, Glenn approached Riel and tried to explain everything. But Riel, who was already angry with Glenn, didn't want to hear any explanation and immediately ran away from him. Riel finally arrived at the beach and could no longer hold back her tears. When she is crying alone, she is suddenly approached by a young man who looks a lot like her older brother, Sion. Riel was very surprised because she thought that Sion had died all this time. Elsewhere, Albert turns out to be spying on Riel through his magic eye. Knowing that the young man who approached Riel was not her real brother, Albert then intended to immediately go to Riel's place. But then, Aliner suddenly appeared to block him. Seeing Aliner trying to block him, Albert immediately knew that the youth disguised as Sion was part of the researchers of Divine Wisdom. Albert and Aliner were immediately involved in a fierce battle in which both of them mustered all the strength they had. In the meantime, Sion lied to Riel by saying he needed the pure magic that only Rumia possessed to survive. Therefore, he instigated Riel to bring Rumia to him and kill anyone who tried to get in his way, including Glenn. At the same time, Glenn arrived and tried to resuscitate Riel that her brother had died, and the young Sion-like youth in front of them was just an imposter. Surprisingly, Riel believes the imposter's words and instead stabs Glenn with her sword, saying that she has found a new purpose in life, a happy life with her brother. Elsewhere, Aliner, knowing that the fake Sion has successfully completed her mission, decides to run away from the fight. Not long after, Sistine, who had just returned to the inn, was startled by the sound of broken glass coming from her room. She rushed over there, and when she arrived at the room, how shocked she was when she saw Riel holding her large sword and Rumia lying covered in blood. Seeing Sistine's arrival, Riel rushed to escape from the place while carrying the unconscious Rumia. Not long after, Albert arrived there carrying Glenn, who was in critical condition. He then asked Sistine to help him heal Glenn because he can't do it alone. Knowing that Glenn cannot be cured with ordinary healing magic, Sistine is willing to help Albert to save Glenn. Albert performs a healing ritual with white magic and Sistine's blood while Sistine tries to deliver her power to a dying Glenn. Meanwhile, Rumia finally woke up and realized that she had been kidnapped by the researchers of Divine Wisdom who wanted to take the pure magic power in her body. Sometime later, Glenn finally woke up and found Sistine sleeping beside him. Albert then tells Glenn that Riel managed to kidnap Rumia. Upon learning that, Glenn suddenly became very angry and blamed Albert and his superiors for using Rumia as bait to find out the goals of the researchers of Divine Wisdom. However, Glenn chose not to discuss this further because their priority at this time was to save Rumia and Riel. At the same time, Birks, Aliner, and the fake Sion seem to have started a ritual to extract pure magic from Rumia's body so that they can complete Project Revive Life. With the tracking magic that Albert secretly implanted in Riel, they could find the whereabouts of Riel, who was currently in the White Alchemy Research Lab, and rushed over there. Seeing the arrival of Glenn and Albert, Birks immediately mobilized his creations, the Chimera monsters, to attack Glenn and Albert. However, those monsters were no match for Glenn and Albert, who could easily annihilate them. Since all of his monsters had been defeated, Birks finally intervened directly to confront them. He then transforms his body into a monster and strengthens to defeat Glenn and Albert. Realizing that his opponent this time would be quite difficult to deal with, Albert then asked Glenn to immediately go save Rumia while he fought Birks alone. Arriving at the place where Rumia was being held, Glenn met Riel and the fake Sion. He tried to make Riel aware that the person next to her was not her older brother. But Riel still insisted that the young man was her brother and instead launched attacks at Glenn repeatedly. In the middle of the fight, Glenn asked Riel about her brother's name. Upon hearing that question, Riel suddenly felt dizzy and stopped the attack while trying to remember her brother's name. Glenn then took the opportunity to immobilize Riel with a magic technique that made her unable to move. After that, he destroys the tool Burks used to extract pure magic from Rumia's body and defeats the fake Sion. On the other hand, Riel is finally starting to remember her past, where she was actually the artificial human that was created by members of Researchers of Divine Wisdom, Sion Rayford and Rainer Lehner, for developing Project Revive Life, where she was designed a genetic code of Zion's sister, Alicia Rayford. In the past, Sion was aware of the experiment's risk and sought help from Glenn to investigate and promise the safety of Rainer and Alicia. However, this would later lead to both Sion and Alicia's death by their partner, Rainer. After Glenn arrived at the laboratory, he found the clone named Riel who was still contained and in a slumber. Glenn later took her in and joined the Imperial Court Mage Corps. Back to the present, the fake Sion is none other than Rainer, who killed Sion and his younger sister to steal the results of the Project Revive Life experiment. Not long after, 3 mindless clones of Riel appeared, which Rainer ordered to kill Riel and Glenn. When one of the clones tried to kill Riel, Glenn immediately rushed to save her. Seeing Glenn struggling to protect himself, Riel decided to get up and fight by Glenn's side to defeat their enemy. Riel finally defeated her clones, as did Glenn, who punched Rainer angrily. On the other hand, Albert also managed to defeat Burks with his fire magic. Glenn then brought Riel and Rumia back to the inn, where Sistine looked very happy that the 3 of them had returned safely. Sistine then hugged Riel, and it was clear that she was very worried about her because, after all, Riel was her precious friend. After the incident at the White Magic Research Lab, Riel, who has no family and no place to live, is adopted by the Fibel family and lives in Sistine's house with Rumia. That night, Riel apologizes to Sistine and Rumia for betraying and hurting them. However, Sistine and Rumia didn't mind it while telling Riel that they are now family and will protect each other. One day, Celica was seen entering a door leading to a dungeon. After walking down a passage in the dungeon, she finally arrived in front of a magic gate and said it was time to enter the underground labyrinth. Meanwhile, in the library, Glenn approaches Sistine and asks about the white magic ritual that Sistine and Albert performed to save her life some time ago. Glenn seemed to have no idea that Sistine could perform such a high-level magic technique, and thanked her for saving his life. But on the other hand, Sistine felt embarrassed and her face turned red as she remembered that she had to kiss Glenn during the ritual. Because Sistine had never kissed a man before, she suddenly felt her heart skip a beat when she recalled the incident when she kissed Glenn repeatedly, even though she kissed him to save his life. Not long after, Rumia and Riel arrived at the place and looked surprised to see Sistine, whose face was red. Riel, who thought that Glenn had done something to Sistine, then took out her large sword and immediately attacked Glenn repeatedly. Glenn then dodged Riel's attack while explaining that he didn't do anything to Sistine. They then headed to the school grounds and accidentally met a young man named Leos Klados, who had just gotten off the horse carriage. Leos, who was the new teacher who was sent to teach at the academy, then greeted Sistine and said he missed her. Sistine, who saw Leo's arrival, suddenly felt very surprised because she did not expect her childhood friend to become a teacher at her school. But what surprised Sistine even more was Leo's statement about the promise they had made as children, where Sistine and Leos had promised to marry when they were adults. Leos seemed to want to make the marriage happen, but Sistine thought she was too young to get married. Meanwhile, in the headmaster's room, Hallie seemed very pleased with the presence of Leos Klados, who had come to replace Glenn because he had met all the qualifications to become a teacher, perhaps even exceeding their expectations. On the other hand, Celica, who seemed suspicious of Leos for suddenly coming to their academy, decided to monitor his movements. Leos, who was appointed as the teacher who replaced Glenn, immediately started his lessons in Sistine's class. The students seemed to like Leos, who was friendly, and his explanations were easy for them to understand. However, Glenn, who was also in the class monitoring Leo's teaching methods, looked worried because Leos taught military-grade magic to his students. Glenn thought that his students were too early to learn military-grade magic. Instead of making them strong, they would be killed if they dared to use military-grade magic without realizing the danger they would be in. During the break, Leos took Sistine to walk in the school garden. After reminiscing about their happy childhood, Leos suddenly asked Sistine to marry him. Sistine was suddenly surprised because Leos was really serious about his statement that he wanted to marry her as soon as possible. On the other hand, Glenn, Rumia and Riel, who were hiding behind the bushes to spy on Sistine and Leos secretly, were also surprised to hear that Leos suddenly proposed to Sistine to be his wife. Glenn seemed excited because he thought that Leos and Sistine were a perfect match. However, this was not the case with Rumia, who had a bad feeling when she saw Leos and assumed that he might have malicious intentions towards Sistine. At the same time, Sistine turns down Leo's proposal and tells him that she wants to fulfill her grandfather's last request to become the greatest magician to reveal the secret of Malgasia's sky castle. Hearing this, Leos told Sistine to forget about her dream because no one had ever been able to reach the sky castle. Even a great magician like Celica, though. Sistine had no idea that Leos was so easy to tell her to give up her dream, which also showed that Leos didn't respect her late grandfather. Concurrently, Glenn, who heard Leo's words, then thought that Leo's was a selfish person. Glenn came out of hiding and defended Sistine, but Leo's rebuked Glenn for interfering in his personal affairs. Sistine, who doesn't want to marry Leo's, then openly tells him that Glenn is her boyfriend. Upon realizing that Sistine was acting, Glenn decided to help her by pretending to be her boyfriend. Glenn embraced Sistine tenderly and told Leo's that he and Sistine had slept together. Sistine, who heard this, suddenly felt embarrassed and accidentally revealed that she had kissed Glenn. Hearing Sistine's confession, Leo's became even more irritated and made Glenn his rival. Surprisingly, Glenn instead challenges Leo's to a magic duel, and the winner will get Sistine. Leo's immediately accepted the challenge without thinking because he felt confident he could beat Glenn. After that, Glenn entered Sistine's class and asked his students to help him during a magic duel against Leo's. On the other hand, Sistine seemed frustrated because she didn't think that the matter of marriage would be this serious. In the evening, Glenn meets Albert at a bar, where Albert tells Glenn about the angel's dust which is said to have spread in the capital. Glenn, who heard this, was shocked because the angel's dust should have been eliminated. Talking about the angel's dust, Glenn was reminded of his closest friend, Sarah Silvers, who died while they were on a mission to eliminate the angel's dust. On the way home, Glenn reminisces about his past with Sarah Silvers, a young woman who is very similar to Sistine, both physically and in personality. At the same time, Leo's is seen planning something with a mysterious man. Even though Leo's wanted the man to get rid of Glenn as soon as possible, he seemed to have plans of his own that Leo's didn't know about. A few days later, the magic duel between Glenn and Leo's finally started. They will have a war strategy battle, where Glenn and Leo's will be the commanders who lead an army consisting of students, while Hallie will act as the referee in the magic duel. At the start of the battle, Leo's and his army were able to overpower the attacks of Glenn and his students and force them to defend themselves. Upon learning Leo's strategy, Hallie became even more in awe of Leo's, who was known as a young man who had high intellect. Surprisingly, Glenn and his students managed to turn things around and repelled the enemies from their line of defense. Apart from devising superior tactics, Glenn also had Riel, who was a former member of the Imperial Court Mage Corps, who could easily defeat Leo's students. After successfully trapping Leo's students in the trap he had set up, Glenn and his students became even more difficult to stop. When Glenn was about to win the battle, Hallie suddenly announced that time had run out, and the battle ended in a draw. Glenn purposely didn't win the battle so they wouldn't have to fight over Sistine anymore. However, Leo still insists on marrying Sistine and challenges Glenn to a one-on-one duel. Sistine, who heard this, suddenly felt angry and asked Glenn and Leo's to stop their rivalry while insisting that she was not something the two men could bet on. But Glenn didn't respond and accepted Leo's challenge. Sistine, who felt irritated, immediately slapped Glenn and hurried away, leaving the two of them. That night, Glenn, who was contemplating while remembering Sarah, was approached by Sistine, who immediately asked about Sarah after overhearing Glenn muttering her name. Glenn then tells about a boy who has a dream of becoming a hero and studies magic in earnest. When he grew up, he managed to become a great magician. However, his power became so terrifying that he couldn't control it, and so many people were killed because of his power. Because he has terrible powers, he hates himself, decides to stop being a magician, and abandons his dream of becoming a hero who saves many people. In his despair, he meets a girl who is always by his side and encourages him to continue pursuing his dreams. The girl is none other than Sarah, and the boy who wants to be a hero is Glenn. At first, Glenn lived a happy life with Sarah, but after Sarah was killed while they were on a mission, Glenn then felt that his life was ruined and hated all things related to magic. Glenn then tells Sistine that he accepts Leo's challenge because he wants to punish him, who is selfish and never respects other people's dreams, as he showed when Leo's mocked Sistine and her grandfather's dream of reaching the Sky Castle. Hearing this, Sistine was happy because Glenn was thinking about her and her dreams. She also thanked Glenn with a smile which reminded Glenn of Sarah. Not long after, Leo suddenly appeared and immediately mocked Glenn, who was nicknamed the Fool in the Imperial Court Mage Corps because Glenn did not have any abilities. Furthermore, Leos tells Glenn that he doesn't deserve to be a teacher because he used to be a cold-blooded killer. Glenn, who heard the insult, then felt irritated and challenged Leos to fight him immediately. Glenn and Leos then got into a fight, where Glenn had no idea that Leos actually had a pretty great fighting ability, even though he was not a soldier. Not only that, Leos turns out to have the ability to create tulpa, a magic technique that can bring imaginary creatures into the real world that can be used as weapons. Since tulpa was a high-level technique that combined white magic and alchemy, Glenn was overwhelmed by the attack and eventually lost. After being defeated by Leos, Glenn left the place without saying anything to Sistine. Seeing her teacher who had just left, Sistine tried to chase after him. But Leo swiftly grabbed Sistine's arm and threatened to reveal Rumia and Riel's true identities to his friends if she refused to marry him. Hearing Leo's words and also seeing the expression on his face as he threatened her, Sistine immediately realized that the young man in front of her was not the Leo she knew. Since his defeat to Leo's, Glenn had not come to school for several days. When Rumia and the students were worried about Glenn, Sistine came and told them that she had accepted Leo's proposal and the two of them would soon get married. Even though Rumia and Riel disapproved of the marriage, they couldn't do anything because it was Sistine's decision. On the wedding day, when Sistine and Leos were about to say the wedding vows, Glenn suddenly appeared wearing the Imperial Court Mage uniform. He immediately stopped the marriage and took Sistine away from there. Glenn then reveals his past as an Imperial Court Mage, where he was actually nicknamed the Fool for having terrible powers. In the middle of the conversation, they were surprised by the residents who had been infected with the angel's dust and were about to attack them. At the same time, Rumia and her classmates who were in the church were attacked by residents. Luckily, Riel and the Imperial Court Mage Corps arrived just in time to save the students. Meanwhile, Glenn, who is determined to no longer hold back to defeat Leos, shows his terrifying power when slaughtering the residents who have become like zombies. Seeing this, Sistine suddenly felt shocked and fear of Glenn until she slapped his hand roughly. Shortly afterward, Leos appears before Glenn and Sistine and reveals that he is actually Jadis Lofen, the former operative of the Imperial Court Mage Corps nicknamed the Justice. Jadis then reveals that he has killed Leos and disguised himself as Leos to carry out his plan to spread the angel's dust in the capital. Glenn then told Sistine to leave the place because his fight against Jadis would endanger her safety. Sistine immediately rushed to leave Glenn. But on the way, she immediately realized her mistake of being rude to Glenn when she discovers his true identity. Sistine also remembered the time when Glenn always protected her and did not hesitate to risk his life to save her. Meanwhile, Glenn is involved in a fierce battle against Jadis, who attacks him repeatedly using Tulpa. Glenn looks overwhelmed by every attack launched by Jadis. When Glenn is in a state of urgency, Sistine appears and decides to help him confront Jadis. Sistine tells Glenn to forget his past and fight with her because, for her, Glenn is a very precious person in her life. After hearing Sistine's words, Glenn regained his confidence and cooperated with Sistine to fight Jadis. By combining their forces, Glenn and Sistine defeat Jadis, although he manages to escape in the end. Not long after, Rumia and Riel arrived at the place along with their friends, who were worried about Glenn and Sistine. Glenn then carried Sistine on his back and asked her if he deserved to be a teacher. Sistine then told Glenn that her presence by Glenn's side was the answer. The anime ends by showing Glenn, who has been teaching again at the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy, and becomes Sistine's homeroom teacher. The moral message that can be learned from this anime is to try to rise from adversity and trauma in the past to live a better life in the present and achieve dreams in the future.